So hi everyone, we begin with our first keynote session, that is the topic Singapore IP decisions. Did we create a Pandora box? Which will be headed by Mr. Alban Kang, partner Bird & Bird ATMD LLP. So can we have a big round of applause for him? And Mr. Alban, over to you.
Right. So good morning, everyone. And firstly, I'd like to thank IPR Gorilla for inviting me to give this keynote address at this webinar today. I'm going to talk about some recent IP cases in Singapore, and the question that I pose really is, did we create a Pandora box? And the reason for this really is there have been two decisions which one has changed the law slightly, and the other has purported to clarify the law. But I'm not sure if these would lead to an easier interpretation of the law, or has it created more issues, more problems, and we've opened up a Pandora box. So I mentioned I was going to talk about two cases. Well, the first case really is the IAdmin case, which was decided by the Singapore Court of Appeal, I think sometime early last year. This has to do with the law of breach of confidence, and the Singapore Court, Apex Court, has actually modified the test for a breach of confidence claim. The old law, as many of you from the common law jurisdiction would know, was set out in the case of Coco and Clark, and essentially you need to establish three elements: the information which possessed the quality of confidence, the information was imparted in circumstances importing an obligation of confidence, and finally there was unauthorized use. In the IAdmin case, the Singapore Court of Appeal actually modified the test while still maintaining the first two elements. It then established a presumption that once the first two elements have been established, then the presumption is that there has been a breach of confidence, and this presumption will only be displaced if the defendant shows or proves that he or she his or her conscience was not affected by the fact that she had or in her possession, his or her possession, confidential information. The facts were quite simple. In fact, it's quite a common kind of scenario. Ex-employees had left the company, they had set up their own company, and provided a product and services that was similar to the former employer, and the former employer then sued for breach of confidence. Excuse me. Before the High Court, the appellants failed because they could not show there was any unauthorized use of the confidential information. And basically, the court held that mere copying of or access to the appellant's materials were insufficient. However, before the Court of Appeal, the court looked at two different types of interests, which guided the operation of a breach of confidence claim. The first was preventing the wrongful gain or profit from the confidential information, and the second was avoiding wrongful loss of the confidential nature of the information. And the criticism of the current COCO test was that it explicitly protects the wrongful gain interest, but provides no recourse for the wrongful loss interest. So the Court of Appeal decided to modify the test. There arises a presumption that an action for breach of confidence should succeed once the first two requirements of the COCO test has been met, that the information was confidential, and that the information must have been imparted in circumstances importing an obligation of confidence. Once that has been established, the burden or the presumption is then displaced and the burden is shifted to the defendant, who must prove that in its conscience was not affected where the plaintiff's wrongful interest had been harmed or determined. For example, the defendant came across the information by accident, the defendant was unaware of the confidential nature of the information, or the defendant believed there was a strong public interest in disclosing the information. So this is basically what the Court of Appeal said. Whatever the explanation, the burden will be on the defendant to prove that its conscience was unaffected. In our view, this modified approach places greater focus on the wrongful loss interest without undermining the protection of wrongful profit interest. So in coming back to the IAdmin case, on the facts, it was not disputed that the materials were confidential. And the respondents had prima facie breached the confidentiality obligation by acquiring, circulating, or referencing the appellant's materials without permission. They were unable to put forth any evidence to displace that presumption that their conscience was not affected, and therefore the court ruled that there was a breach of confidence and there was damages to be assessed. So the test for the breach of confidence claim has therefore now been revised, I would say, or amended. That all the plaintiff has to show is the first two elements in Coco and Clark, and then the burden shifts onto the defendant to show that the confidential information that may be that is in his possession arose without any conscience on his part, right? For example, the duty of confidence can arise independent of any contractual non-disclosure obligation. It would also mean that the defendant would have to show that, for example, he doesn't know that information was confidential or that it was publicly available, or what happens if there is a case of subconscious copying. So the question now is, now that the law has been changed, or rather the test for a breach of confidence case claim has been changed, the question is, does this put a more onerous burden on the defendant to show that its conscience is clear? Its conscience is, it may have, for example, subconsciously copied some information while it was in his employment of his former employer. So is that, going to put a greater burden on the defendant in defending a breach of confidence claim? Well, that left to be seen. And so we'll see. We'll have to look at, the cases or the case law as it develops following the IAdmin case. The next case is a patent pharmaceutical case, and it deals with the patent linkage system in Singapore. The patent linkage system in Singapore is very similar to some of the patent linkage systems in other countries. At the time of seeking market approval, the applicant has to file a patent declaration form, and it needs to declare if there's a third-party patent involved in respect of the therapeutic product, and gives notice to the patent owner, and within 45 days of that service, the patent owner may apply to court for an injunction or declaration that there will be an infringement of the patent if it's allowed to be distributed in Singapore, and on commencement of such an action, the whole application process is put on hold. There's a 30-month moratorium on the product registration. The issue in the Zyphus case really is what patents need to be declared, remembering that the phrase that is used, patent in respect of a pharmaceutical product. And there are consequences. For example, failure to declare the relevant patent can have serious consequences when the omission is found out. On the other hand, if you do, make the patent declaration, then there's a very strong likelihood that the patent owner will file a court action, which would then trigger a 30-month stay on the product registration. So there's this conflicting interest, and this pertains primarily to generic drug companies trying to enter the market, and the innovators, the pharmaceutical companies trying to protect their market share using their patents. So what happened in the Zyphus case? Essentially, they filled up the declaration and they did not disclose any patents. So the patentee then sought a court declaration that Zyphus had omitted to disclose matter that was material to the application, i.e. the patent, and therefore that was, with that declaration, the patentee hoped to get the registration cancelled. Before the High Court in Singapore, Zyphus contended that it did not knowingly or intentionally omit to declare the process. However, the court held that intention was not a requirement, and since Zyphus had omitted to disclose the patent, then it would grant the declaration that material matter had been omitted. On appeal, excuse me. On appeal, I just need to get a sip of water here. On appeal, Zyphus then abandoned its earlier argument and then tried to argue for the first time that a process patent did not fall within Regulation 23 because it was not a patent in respect of a pharmaceutical product. So the issue before the Court of Appeal was really whether or not a patent for a process came within the definition of a patent in respect of a therapeutic product. This is what the Court of Appeal decided. In answer to our question during discussions, the appellant accepted that it was logically possible for the drug to have been manufactured using processes in Millennium's process patents. Although Zyphus' position was that its therapeutic product did not use the process to make potizomic. Potizomic was the ingredient which was the subject matter of the process patent. And this is what the Court of Appeal said. In our opinion, this meant that the process patents here were in respect of the therapeutic product because the active ingredients in that product could have been made using the patented process. And notice the Court of Appeal said could have been made using the patented process. So this is a very wide definition that has been given to the term patent in respect of a therapeutic product. Well, essentially, this was what the Court of Appeal held. The plain text of the regulation suggests that process patents were included since patent under the Patents Act includes a patent process or process patents. The inclusion of process patents was consonant with the legislative purpose of Regulation 23, that is to give notice and protection to the patent protectors, and there is no reason why product patents should be accorded more protection than process patents. Well, this is the Court of Appeal's decision. It is clarified what is meant by patent in respect of a therapeutic product. However, we now end up with a situation as, what is meant by the patents to be declared as long as it could have been made using that process. Of course, in the Zyphers case, Zyphers' position was that it used a completely different process. So the question is, process patents here could cover a gamut of processes used in the manufacturing of a therapeutic product or a pharmaceutical product. There are multiple ways of making an API. There are multiple ways to produce drug compounds, and the number of patents could be potentially very large. Does it mean then that an entrant to the market needs to declare each and every process patent? I mean, a search on a ingredient like botensilimab could come up with maybe 15, 20 patents. Does it mean then that you need to give notice to all the patentees? So this would be a very onerous burden on the new entrant to the market. And it could also expose the new entrant to multiple patent infringement actions by the various patent owners. It's interesting to note that in all other countries, the United States, Canada, Korea, which has a patent linkage system, process patents are specifically excluded from the patent linkage system. However, somehow or other, that was overlooked when the patent linkage system was introduced into Singapore. And so we have in Singapore this sui generis situation where a new entrant to the market would need to declare any process patent that could have been used to manufacture the product. Again, while the Court of Appeal appears to have clarified the law, the question now comes as to how the law is going to be put into practice, and have we, as I stated in my earlier comments, opened a Pandora box when it comes to patent linkage in Singapore. Right, so that's the end of my presentation. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and perhaps if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
It has been a wonderful session which has been headed by Mr. Kang today. So I would be requesting everyone, if they have questions, they can write on the chat box on the right of their screen, or they can join online face-to-face and ask questions. Thank you so much. Won Jun Chui, that is Tom, says that it was a great informative session. Thank you. We have Heather. She said, excellent job. Thanks for your insights here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Kang, for joining for today's keynote session.